everybody. It's great to be back here again. Tomorrow it's Friday. We are completing the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, Baruch Hashem with a double portion. And obviously there are so many topics here and we won't be able to discuss and cover them all, but I want to focus on a very important concept that we have to try to understand. I mean, it's sort of at the beginning of Matot, the first of the doubles, and the war of Midyan, because right now we're in war in Israel. We also were not, we don't know what's going to be in a few hours from now. I mean, everything is always here in the land so volatile and things change so quickly. But we always have to remember that the Torah is our blueprint. And God looked in the Torah, He created the world, and everything that goes on in the Torah. And if we learn in depth our portions, God always gives us insight and ways of being able to cope with the present situation. We have to learn the lessons that the Torah teaches us. And today we're going to talk about Midyan. And Midyan in Hebrew, what does it mean? Where does that word come from? And if we think about, we know that in Torah, the numerical value of words has tremendous meaning, and Midyan is 104 in the numerical value, which happens to come out to the same thing as Sodom. Sodom meaning Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom is also 104. And the reason I'm mentioning this, I was looking and trying to search, if I can find sources, ancient sources, or from our great rabbis, our sages, that relate to the Midianites. How do they refer to the Midianites, and what kind of rectification we have regarding them? And I found two very interesting sources I want to bring down, and then I'm going to actually try to show how, they sort of hinted to some certain deep things they hint to, but I'm going to show how in reality this develops. There are sources that can actually strengthen and reinforce what they said. Of course, they don't need reinforcement. Our great rabbis, but it's always good to see because it's an important lesson for our understanding what's going on today and all that. So let's begin, and I want to show you. And first, let's begin by the actual verses themselves. We're talking about the, Numbers chapter 31, verse number 1. I'm going to read the first few verses. It says, "Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe lemei." God says to Moshe, saying, "Nikom nikmat bnei Israel." And He says, "I want you to avenge He want you to avenge the avengement of Israel." God is calling this our nikama, our vengeance. Me'et Midyanim, from the Midianites. Achal te'asef alamech, and afterwards you will be called to the nation. What does that mean? Afterwards you will be ending your life. So Moshe Rabbeinu was actually given here the last purpose, I wouldn't say the last purpose, but the last major commandment of his life was to deal with the Midianites. And it goes on to say, "Vaydaber Moshe la'am lemor." Moshe Rabbeinu runs immediately to the nation and tells them, quickly. Hechaltzu means to act with speed and gather the army together. V'yu al Midyan letei nikmat Hashem, to give the vengeance of God. So here Moshe Rabbeinu uses, not only God used the word avenge, the vengeance of it, the avenging Israel, and Moshe Rabbeinu used we're avenging God here. So it's interesting. We'll talk about that soon. Why they changed the verses here. Why is it changed? And he chooses 1,000 soldiers from each of the tribe, altogether 12,000 soldiers, etc. And then it says in verse number 6, "Vayishlach otam Moshe 1,000 So Moshe Rabbeinu sends 1,000 from each tribe. Ve'ed Pinchas ben Elazar, and Pinchas, the son of Elazar." So Pinchas, or Phineas, as we all read about last week's portion, he, the son of Elazar, the high priest, he sent, right? He's the son of Elazar, as we all know, the grandson of Aaron. We spoke about that in detail last week. And very interesting, look what it says. It says in the verse, "Uklei HaKodesh, the Chatzotzot HaTorah biyado." What is he holding in his hand? He's holding Klei HaKodesh, the vessels, the holy vessels, and the trumpets. And Rashi explains right away. Rashi explains, and I want to read what Rashi says, because this is really fascinating how it's sort of a hint to what's going on today. And I want to read this Rashi. It's very interesting. You'll get a little humor out of this. And what does Rashi say? Rashi says like this: Uklei HaKodesh, the holy vessels, Zeh Aaron v'Tzitz. That's the Ark of the Covenant, and the tzitz, the band that the high priest wore on his head, one of his special unique garments that he had. Shaya bilam imahem. And here listen what the Rashi says. Rashi brings down, of course, Midrash. And he's saying because Bilyam was with them, with the Midianites in the battle. Umafriach malchei Midyan bekshafim. And he was able to take the Midianite kings. We know that there were these 5 Midianite kings, and he was able to lift them off the ground with his magic. V'atzmo porech imahem. And he himself was able to fly with them. So literally they were lifted off the ground. They were like these rockets. It was like these katbamim, as we say, these unmanned planes. Now the enemy was in the sky. He lifted them off the ground. So what did Pinchas do? How did he contend with this magician? Bilam was able to lift them off the ground like rockets, like these unmanned planes. He had these planes with the men, right? And it says that he showed them the tzitz. The tzitz is again, we just mentioned a moment ago, right? So when he showed them the holy tzitz, which says Kodesh Lashem, right, holy to God, on the tzitz itself, you see the letters of God's name, and that literally grounded them. Shashem Chakukpo, Rashi says that God's name is carved within the tzitz. Ve'em noflim, and immediately they fell down to the ground. That's why it says regarding the kings, the Midianite kings, that they fell on top of those who were on the kill, those who were slain. And so they're falling from the sky, from the sky onto those who were killed on the ground, and which is very fascinating. And then they finished them off. Whatever it was, we see here very interesting that out of nowhere, there's always some kind of hint in the portion. Rashi brings down this midrash. We're talking about those evil forces that are literally found ways of attacking us with these sort of rockets or unmanned planes. And here it's a similar kind of thing. It's unbelievable how it's hinted in the portion. But of course, we're going to get to the deep meaning behind all these things and what does this all mean. But in reality, we see from the beginning here this mission, this great mission. Moshe Rabbeinu had to fight against the Midianites, and we want to know more about, as we said before, what did they represent? What was their whole issue here? Right? And I want to read the first part of Rashi, and Rashi begins to reveal to us what is going on over here with this husk of the Midianite husk, and then the 2 commentaries that I found that talk about this, and we'll develop that more. So Rashi says like this. Rashi says, Otam ve Pinchas. It says them and Phineas. Magidri Pinchas shakol keneged kulam. It teaches that Pinchas was actually weighed against all of them. That's how great of a warrior he was, and his righteousness and all that. And umipnei ma halach Pinchas v'lo halach Elazar. So Rashi says, asks the question is, why did Pinchas go? He's the grandson of Aaron and not the son of Aaron, right? He's the father of Pinchas, Elazar. Why didn't Elazar go? Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu. So God says, Mi shitchil b'mitzvah, someone who started doing a mitzvah. We know that he killed Kozvi Batzur and Zeli ben Salu. And Rashi says, Sharag Kozvi Batzur, Yigmol, let him finish the job. He started, let him finish the job. Right? Don't stop. It's another hint of what's going on, as we all know. There's a lot of pressure on Israel to stop the job in middle. Let's stop the job, right? We did enough. No, we have to finish the job. We have to finish the mitzvah we began. Davar acher, Rashi says, another thing, and here is really, this is what I want to focus on now. Shalach linkom nikmat Yosef avimo. He actually went to take another kind of revenge over. What was the revenge? Shneimar v'Midyanim achu oto. It was the Midianites that actually sold Joseph, as we all know, and mentioned in Genesis 37, where it says that the Midianites, they were the ones who sold Yosef HaTzadik. And how do we know that the mother of Pinchas was from Yosef, as it says, Mibnot Putiel, from the daughters of Putiel. And we know from here, and we spoke about this last week, Putiel, the Gemara says, and Rashi brings it down, Mizer Yitro, on one hand, they were from the side of Yitro, who was from Midyan as well, Shepitei Magalim Lavodah Zarah, that fattened the calves for idol worship. That's where he came from. He was a priest of the Midianites. Umizer Yosef, and from the seed of Joseph, Shepipet Pitzro, right? That was able to pitpet comes from, to shout down, right? When someone pitpet means someone to speak, using his ability of overcoming his evil urge and all that. Joseph, who rectifies the brit, the covenant, was able to knock away his evil urge over there, of course, referring to the wife of Potiphar, but we know Joseph represents the foundation and all that. So we see here from Rashi, fascinating, there are two aspects here. The aspects of Yitro, on one side, right, where he comes from Elazar, and that whole thing of what I spoke about, a couple of weeks ago, we spoke about how Yitro represented, the nations, those who return and have come to Israel. And they leave the husks of the world and they come to Israel, and that was that one side over here, leaving the idol worship, believing that, that's what he did in the past. And the other side of Joseph, who contends with the whole thing of representing the covenant of, the covenant, which is the circumcision, the Brit, representing our holiness, not to fall, God forbid, to the evil urges. And there's another whole side which Joseph represents, we're going to talk about, which is the love of brotherly love, right? So, getting back to what I opened up with now, so we see, I'm trying to put things in order here, so we see the first approach of Rashi and talking about the Husk, the Midianite Husk, coming from, Midyan comes from the side of Yosef and Jethro and Yitro, having to contend with that, right? So we have to understand what this is all about, and what kind, and the whole coming to revenge against the selling of Joseph. So it's something very deep here. And I want to read Gur Aryeh. Gur Aryeh is a commentary on Rashi and on many other, one of the great, in the 1500s, he lived, the Maharal of Prague, and Prague, one of the great masters of I can say, of Jewish deep teachings. We call Pnimiut Torah, the inner aspects of Torah, which refer to the Kabbalistic teachings and the very deep Jewish faith. And the Gur Aryeh explains like this. He says, Shalach limkom nikmat Yosef. What is Rashi referring to? Rashi says that actually it was Pinchas that went to avenge what happened, the selling of Joseph. And he says like this. He brings down, and he says, Kach perusho. This is the meaning of it. Ki achar shera Moshe, after Moshe Rabbeinu saw Shemechirat Yosef Ayidei Midyanim, that the selling of Joseph was done by the Midianites. Ra'a shemidyanim minagdim hayu Yosef. He saw that the Midianites were clashing with Joseph. Okay, if that wasn't the case, lo ya mitgalgel ayidei Midyanim b'chiyato shel Yosef. If that wasn't the case, it wouldn't end up that he was sold precisely to the Midianites. So when someone comes against you, usually, and you end up in their hands, obviously it shows that there's a clash between these two, what the two sides represent. Because he says, Ein migalgalim chova l'adam ela yidei mishu minaged lo, right? When someone, there's an expression in Judaism where migalgalim schut al dei zakai, God places the merit, a schut is a merit by one who's worthy of it, and an obligation to one who's not worthy, right? An obligation. And therefore, when someone merits in doing something very special, God placed that merit in his hand. There's a reason that God placed that merit in his hand. And the opposite, when someone does something bad to somebody, there's a reason why they were chosen for that purpose. They themselves are evil. So the whole purpose here is poor Joseph was sold into whatever captivity by the Midianites. He was sold to the Midianites. So the Midianites themselves, obviously, they're doing an evil thing. That they would, by taking Joseph and purchasing Joseph and all that. This reveals something about who they are. We have to understand who these Midianites were, of course, the brothers were the ones who did the terrible thing by selling them to the Midianites. They bought him, right? So they were also, of course, participants. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But so the Maral goes on to say, Vaya Yosef hefech Midyan. Joseph was the opposite of the Midianites. And Rashi, and he explains, Zaya gadol ma'od be'elva. He was extremely holy, he watched over himself regarding sexual offenses. And the Midianites, we see the exact opposite. Hifkiru nishotehem uvnotehem b'shvil elva kedei liznot. What do? They actually let their daughters go out there, totally set them free to make trouble, of course, for Israel. That was the whole point. But they let their daughters totally, totally, lower themselves to terrible, terrible, terrible things. I mean, think about that. They were used as a ploy, as harlotry, to go ahead and try to bring down the children of Israel into idol worship and all this, and they totally, as we say in Hebrew, lafkir, totally to release their daughters, for the worst things. And that we see the exact opposite of what Joseph, who represents someone who held back and didn't fall to the wife of Potiphar. So we see here that the contrast between the two sides, which is fascinating. That's the approach of the Gur Aryeh. Okay, that's his approach. And now I want to show you another approach, which come together. Which again, this is I'm not going to go to all the details. This is more lengthy in wording, but it's very extremely deep. It's Kabbalistic, and it's from a book called Likutei Torah. Likutei Torah literally means, the gatherings of the Torah. Right? It's different Likutim explanations. That was written by the Admor HaZaken. Admor HaZaken was the one who wrote the Balatanya, the famous Rav Zalman Meladi, one of the great giants, of Hasidism. He was the founder of the Chabad Hasidim. He lived at the times of the Vilna Gaon, talking about the 1700s, late 1700s. So he writes like this, and it's fascinating concept here. And I'm not going to go to the question. He asks very, very interesting questions, and we don't have time to go through all of them. But I'll write down. He says like this. He's saying, "Bechinat Midyan, umamash neged bechinat shem havaya." He's saying something very deep here. We have to understand. He's saying that the Midianites we're talking about the Husk of the Midianites, were opposed God's fallen name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, God's name. And he's saying, therefore, ולכן קודם מתן תורה היה צריך להיות הכנעת קליפת מדיין על ידי יתרו, כהן מדיין. So therefore, before the receiving of the Torah, right, one explanation is that Jethro came before the whole Jethro, of course, comes and joins Israel before Matan Torah, right? Before the Torah is given itself. And therefore, there was a very important thing of the necessity for the husk of Midyan to fall before the receiving of the Torah. This is what he explains. And we see, I want to read a couple more things that he talks about. When he goes ahead and talks about, there are two, we know that, the two temples. The first temple he talks about was destroyed, we all know, because this is, of course, things that relate to now, was destroyed because of three cardinal sins, Gilur Arayot, sexual sins, Shfichut Damim, murder, and idol worship. And now he explains the second temple, and here he's going to connect the rectification that has to be done through the Midianites to the second temple. And he says, אך בבית שני לא היה חטא במידות הרעות עצמן, כי אם בשנאת חינם. So we all know the second temple was the hatred from brotherly love, right? That was the big hatred. And he says, כי אם שנאת חינם שזהו לשון מדyan, that's what the word Midyan means. Midyan refers to riv, argument, מדון. ומידה זו שאינה רע גמור, אך הוא מקור התהוות הרע. That's the source of where evil began. And that's hatred, because that's the opposite of a kedusha lokit, of the holiness of God. She davka b'chinat achdut, because the whole holiness of the state of God's name, God's fallen name, is achdut v'itkallalut shu yisod kol haTorah, is unification, achdut, and hitkalalut. Hitkalalut means to bring everything together, to unify everything, which is the foundation of the Torah, is achadut. And therefore, Midyan v'nagad mafridu aminaged l'shem havaya. So he is like literally the force that separates between God's name, which is the opposite of oneness. So I'm not going to go now. He goes into a very interesting Kabbalistic discussion. That's for another time to go into details, to try to understand what he's saying, very extremely deep things, that are very hard to understand. Only those who are masters of the Kabbalistic traditions, but, certain of the basic stuff we can understand. And he's saying that this klipa of Midyan refers to that breach in brotherly love. It refers to the argument and riv, madon. Those are all the things that he's referring. So he's showing another side. So I think what's really interesting, and we see how this explanation of the Admor Zaken and the explanation of Rashi, right, which explained by the Maharal, there are two sides. One side refers to the breach of brotherly love, which from the Admor Zaken, which was the cause of our destruction of the second temple, and we're still not have rebuilt our third temple till we actually overcome this husk, correct? And the other one, which was the sexual offenses, and they're related, of course. There's Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph, worked in both directions, right? On one hand, he was so pure and holy regarding his sexual behavior. At the other way, he was extremely involved in trying to unite the brothers, and he was the target of that hatred from the brothers had for him. So it's fascinating to see. So after we saw those two sides, I want to now show, and I'm going to give a couple of examples in the Torah itself where we see these two things come to life. Okay? We'll actually see through the verses themselves this clarification. And I'd like to show just a couple of sources. Number one, let's ask the question, where do we first find Midyan in the Torah? And if we look going way back in Genesis, Chayei Sarah in chapter 25, I'll read a couple of verses here, and this is where we find Midyan in the Torah. It says, Vayosef Avraham, Abraham went, Vayikach Isha, and he took a wife, Ushma Keturah, and the name was Keturah. We all know Keturah was Hagar, right? That was his wife Hagar, his other wife besides Sarah. After Sarah passes away, it's talking about over here. ותלד לו את זמרן ואת יוקשן ואת Midyan. So we see that Yishbak ואת Shuach, so different names of the children born. And one of these children that were born to Keturah were Midyan. So Midyan goes way back. The times of Abraham, it was one of the children of Abraham. Interesting, right? From the side of Keturah, just like Ishmael, who was the son of the Hagar, Keturah. So also Midyan, which we all know, interesting that they're in those areas. It's the location of Midyan is we say it's near Edom, near the Edomite mountains over there. It's near in the desert areas across the Jordan, Transjordan, in the south. And here we see that the actual source comes from Keturah. It comes from Abraham's wife Keturah. Now, if we follow along, I want to continue with this line. Where else do we see the Midianites in the Torah? And we're going to continue over here. And it's interesting, if you look in Genesis chapter 36, I found another source where it says, Vayamot Husham vayimloch tachtav Hadad ben Bedad. These are the generals of Esau, Hamaket Midyan b'stei Moab, right, who struck the Midianites in the field of Moab. Right, so they entered the area of the Moabites, the Midianites, and there was a battle. And Rashi explains, and he says like this. And we see that the Edomites actually had a war with the Midianites. And Rashi says, so we see that they were at each other's throats. Here we see a lack of love, even it's coming from the Gentiles, but they didn't get along, right? They were fighting with one another, the Edomites against the Moabites. So we see, again, the husk of the lack of brotherly love comes out of the Midianites, correct? And we made Bil'am asu shalom. And during the times, Rashi mentions, by the way, on the side, during the times of Bilam, they made peace in order to war against Israel. So the enemies of Israel that are fighting with one another, that are hating one another, right, they'll get together to war against Israel. And this, of course, connects to today. We see the Hezbollah are Shiites, and they're actually combining with the Arabs of Gaza. The Arab of Gaza are not Shiites, right? So the Muslims, have different factions amongst the Muslim world, but the Iranians are also Shiites, right? So we all know there are something called Sunni Muslims. The Sunni Muslims are the majority of the Muslims living, here in Israel. They're all Sunni Muslims, and are about us, most Sunnis, but they're willing to work together. The Hamas, are working together with Hezbollah just to come against Israel. Very similar to that same Husk, because we know Keturah, who was from that side of the Husk from the Muslims came out of those lines. They actually are working together, as we see here, to fight against Israel later on today in present time, which is fascinating. We see that another hint of what's going on. Now, if we continue this, and I want to get back to proof. So we see here again the lack of brotherly love coming out of the Midianites. And I'll give you another example. We know that Moshe Rabbeinu, when he actually began his life on his own, because he was, as a young child, put in the Nile River, taken to Egypt. In Egypt, I'm saying, then taken by the daughter of Paro, right away to the palace, and he goes out to his brothers, and he sees what's going on, and then he sees, as we all know, an Egyptian man striking one of his brothers, and Moshe Rabbeinu immediately responds, and he kills the Egyptian, and he puts him in the sand. And then later on, shortly after, he meets Datan Vaviram, these two Jews that are arguing with one another. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, what are you fighting with one another and all that? And they said, wait a second, who made you judge over us? Are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptians? So Moshe Rabbeinu knew right away that word got out what he did, so he runs away. And where does he run to? It says in Exodus chapter 2, verse number 15, it says, Vayeshev be'eretz Midyan, Vayeshev ala be'er. He goes to the Midianite land, and he sits by the be'er, by the well. And so we see his life as an independent Jew now, having to contend with the world, what's going on as an independent individual. He begins in the Midyan. So Midyan is something that he begins his life with, his independent life, I'm saying, very interesting. And he has to contend with it again at the end of his life, which is fascinating understanding. And here, when he goes there, as we all know, the famous meeting that he has, where he finds his wife, right? And he finds his wife over there. And Rashi says, I'd like to bring this down. Rashi says, what does he say? He sat in Midyan. Rashi says, like this, Rashi mentions, Lashon Yeshiva, Lamad miyakov, shenizdaveg lo zifugo al be'er. So Moshe Rabbeinu learned from Jacob, that just like Jacob, found his wife Rachel at the well, and so does Moshe Rabbeinu find his wife Tzipporah. So he followed that same footsteps of the forefathers. But what is fascinating is that the Midianites, for Moshe Rabbeinu, is sort of a nostalgic place, and that's where he, in a way, he first had his freedom, running away and being able to get married. He lived there with Jethro and the family. He had 7 daughters there, as we all know. Later on, one of those daughters we just met about, Pinchas, marries one of those daughters. Elazar's father, so it comes from that lineage of Jethro. But anyway, it's fascinating that so Moshe Rabbeinu has some good memories of Midyan on one hand, but he has to deal with the Husk. And don't forget, when his son is born, Gershom, he says, I am a stranger in a foreign land. So he never related to the Midyaners as a whole, but but there still must have been some interesting inner feelings he had, having to cope with this problem at the end of his life. God saying, you will now revenge, what they did the Midianites, which is fascinating in itself. Now, I want to show, so we just saw some interesting things regarding the brotherly love, right? The Midianites. And number one, Moshe Rabbeinu was running away from strife, from brothers fighting with one another, and he comes to Midyan. So right away we said, the connection, when the Midyan awakens, we see there's a problem with brotherly love, right? So Moshe Rabbeinu comes there. It's extremely interesting. Not only that, Moshe Rabbeinu is fighting at the he has to chase away the Midianites that are starting up with the daughters of Yitro at the well. So it shows these people are not caring about a brother and sister. They don't have that brotherly love. And so again, it connects us very well to that whole concept. Now, the next connection I want to go now again to show also the an additional stuff relating to so again this relates to Yosef HaTzadik, as we said, rectifying that whole thing of brotherly love. But the other is also a couple of different aspects over here we spoke about. One is brotherly love, and one is that the sexual offenses that they tried to, they could basically lured Israel into the trap. It's very interesting that Midyan, I said, is 104 in Gematria, which is Dom, which hints to the sexual offenses, but also Tzayid. Tzayid is Tzadik Yud. Dal is also 104, which is to lure, is to trap. They trapped Israel into that net. Now, Rashi says, and it's interesting, we look in Parashat Pinchas, and I want to go here now for a moment. In Parashat Pinchas is where it's first mentioned the war of the Midianites. Here, this week's chapter, it takes place, the whole thing, but it's sort of hinted right away after the whole story of Pinchas, what they did. God says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Tzaror et Midyanim, you shall tzaror et Midyanim, v'hikitem otam, you shall strike them. There are two things. It could have just said, smite the Midianites. What does it say, tzaror? Additional word. And Rashi said, and first the next verse says, Ki tzorim heim lechem, benichlehen, because they are showing their hatred towards you with all their different plans that they have. Benichlehen means their evil ways. Asher niklu lechem al dvar pa'ol, right? The whole way they set you up with Pa'ol on Kozbi, the daughter of Kozbi. She was the daughter of Kozbi. Batsol was the daughter of the Midianite prince and all that. So God says to them, you have to do two things. Not only strike them, but soror otam. What is soror otam? Rashi says like this. Rashi says, soror kimo zacho v'shamor. It's a verb. It's a commandment. What is the verb meaning? It's a present in the present tense. Alechem la'ayev otam. You have to actually hate them. So Rashi, it's a very powerful expression here. It's not mentioned to a lot of nations. It's only mentioned here with the Midianites. Is that you have to literally, awaken amongst you the hatred towards the enemy, and what of the terrible acts that they did to you, that they're again luring you into their traps and falling into to the sexual iniquity which led to idol worship and all that. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy they did, and you have to hate those ways of them. Despise those ways. It's really not only to strike them, but to hate what they stand for. Okay? And Rashi brings down again, Rashi says over there, they totally allow their daughters, to go free regarding harlotry, just to bring you down with idol worship of Pa'ol. So this is again their ways, and we see how Joseph has to rectify this, correct? That's the other side of Joseph. We said the brotherly love as opposed to the other side, the sexual offenses. Now, okay. And we see here, which is something really fascinating, that Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't hesitate at all, although because God tells him he's going to pass away. But Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't hesitate, and he immediately responds by, getting Israel ready for war. And I want to read to you a beautiful midrash, which talks about again the issues that these Midianites, that we have to cope with. And Rashi brings down like this. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, the midrash is like this, the midrash Rabbah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ilo haya rotze Moshe l'chiyot kama shanim haya chai. If Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to live more years, he could have easily done it. Shamalo Kadosh Baruch Hu, God tells him, Nikom, right, first take revenge against the Midianites, V'achal te'aseh, and afterwards you will pass away. Tala katuv mitato b'Midyan. So we see how the Torah ties the death of Moshe Rabbeinu to this last, battle he has to fight against the Midianites. Ela lo diacha. So what do we learn from this? It teaches us shivcho shel Moshe. This teaches us the praise of Moshe Rabbeinu. Amar b'shvil shechyei yakev nikmat Yisrael miyad. I'm sorry, because of me to get more years of life, I'm going to push off the avengement of Israel, the revenge that we have to take against the Midianites. Immediately it says, Hichaltzu mitchem anashim latzava. Immediately the word Hichaltzu means quickly, with tremendous speed. He got the soldiers ready. And here the Midrash continues to say, Anashim latzava. What is Anashim? Anashim are righteous people. Right. Anashim, the word Anashim means righteous. Those who went to battle have to be the most righteous people. Then we have the best chance of being, successful. And he goes on to say, Moshe Rabbeinu changes what God said in the beginning. God said in the beginning, I want you to go to battle against the Midianites, to revenge Israel. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to revenge God. He sort of changed who's revenging who? And the Midrash right away relates to this question. Why did he change it for? And he says something like this. He says something like this. The Midrash says something very beautiful. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu lehem eino ela diko shelachem. This is your battle. This is your judgment, not mine. God says to Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? Because shegamuli la zikota. What happened was, in other words, God says, listen, these Midianites, the ones who caused you all the problems. So it's your issue. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, God, if we were uncircumcised, or we were worshipping idols, or kofrei mitzvot, or we didn't believe in the Torah, in the commandments, they wouldn't hate us. And they wouldn't run after us. But because of the commandments that you gave us, that's why it's your revenge. Fascinating. And this, of course, if we just take some of these examples to heart, it's so relevant today because we know a lot of the problems we have and the lack of unity for those who don't want to believe in the Torah, those who are running away from the Torah. And that gives power to this husk of those forces that come against us when they don't want to accept and believe in the Torah. There's another, I'm going to have time, I don't want to go on. There's another beautiful example I wanted to give, but I don't know if I have time to go into example now of Moshe Rabbeinu. Maybe quickly I just feel it has to mention it. Moshe Rabbeinu, we all know, we have a very interesting verse we read in this. Again, we're finishing the books of Numbers, so we could talk about the whole entire book of Numbers. In Parashat Balotcha, in Numbers 11, something very unusual. Moshe Rabbeinu, when the people of Israel are making trouble, and it says, "Vayishma Moshe ta'am boched mishpachot." Moshe Rabbeinu hears the families crying, the nation crying to the families. This is brought down in chapter 11 in Numbers. Ish lefetach olo, everyone at the entrance to the tent. Vayicharaf Hashem, the gods got very angry, it says, and the eyes of they named Moshe Ra, and it was very bad in Moshe's eyes as well. And right away, the next verse is what makes something that really bothered me when I read the verse, and I'll show you in a moment why. Moshe Rabbeinu responds like this. Vayomer Moshe el Hashem, Moshe says to God, Lama haraota lavdecha. Why are you making, why you give me trouble? He says to God. That's another issue. Why not find favor in your eyes? To place the burden of this nation upon me. So here's something very unusual. Moshe Rabbeinu is complaining that it's too much for him. Did I give birth to this nation? That you're telling me, did I give birth to him? That you're telling me to carry him in my heart? To carry it on my chest as someone who will carry a newborn. Here Moshe Rabbeinu is sort of, God, just take this responsibility from me. But why would this bother me so much? Because if we go back in the portion of Exodus with the sin of the golden calf, what does Moshe Rabbeinu say after they sin and God wants to punish them? Moshe Rabbeinu says, forgive them? You can look in verse in Exodus 32. Verse 32. It's easy to remember. Heart. Lev is 32. It's the same. Lev in Hebrew means heart. And what is Moshe Rabbeinu? The nation was in his heart, right? What did he say? Vatayim tisach hatatam. If you will forgive them, yes. If Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, God, if you give them good. If not, erase me from the book you wrote. That's a very harsh response. Here Moshe Rabbeinu was not complaining after they sinned with the golden calf. Why did I didn't give birth to them? But here he's complaining in Balotcha. But what was the sin of the nation? Why did Moshe Rabbeinu complain over there? And the answer is very, very simple when we understand what they did. There Rashi says, what were they doing? Mishpachot nesafim uvochim. They're crying. And he brings down what the rabbis say. Al iskei mishpachot, regarding family matters. What kind of family matters? Al arayot hanesaot lem, because they were no longer permitted certain marital relations with certain individuals. In other words, they were more limited in who they could marry. Before they were allowed to marry certain family members, and now it became more limited. And that got them very upset. And so therefore it's connected to what? To that whole idea who they can be with, their choice. Again, it's connected to the desires, flesh desires. And therefore Moshe Rabbeinu, when it came to those desires, Moshe Rabbeinu said, God, I can't handle it. That's the hardest thing to rectify. And we see it right over there, which is fascinating. And therefore, this connects to what we're saying when Moshe Rabbeinu comes at the end of his life, and God is saying, we have to rectify Midyan. Midyan has those. They're the ones who brought Israel down through their sexual offenses that they made them do, that they could lured them into, and of course the lack of brotherly love, which is both sides, and that is what we have to rectify, which is another fascinating example that we just spoke about. And I'll just bring a couple of more before I close this, and because they're really very important to show what we're talking about. There's two sides of rectification. When is Midyan mentioned later on in the Bible? We find it with Gideon, Judge Gideon, as we all know, who was literally living, we have on Itamar, the place where he's buried, and which is literally on one of our hilltops here, in the area of Joseph, this whole area. And Gideon, as we all know, has to deal with the problem. What is the problem? I'll read to you a little about these verses. It's brought down in Judges 6. And it says, Israel did bad in God's eyes, and God placed them into the hands of the Midianites. So again, we're dealing with the husk of the Midianites. And it says, Vatawaz yad Midyan al Yisrael, and the Midianites lifted their hands on Israel. And this is fascinating. Look what happened. When the Midianite lifts up its head, that husk. So what did Israel have to do? Israel, it says, Vataz yad Midyan al Yisrael, mipnei Midyan, asu lehem bnei Yisrael et haminarot. So Israel had to build tunnels in the mountains. In other words, they had to build special bypass roads and caves and all kinds of fortresses. Vayayim zayis, and if Israel would be planting the seeds, the Midianites would come and Amalek with them, and they would come upon those fields and destroy the fields. Vayachanu aleihem, vayashchitu et yevol haaretz, they would destroy their produce. Exactly what's happening, we all know, in Gaza and in parts of Israel. And they wouldn't leave food for Israel, right? V'sev v'shor v'chamor, lamb, shor v'chamor. Ki hen u'miknehem yalu v'oleihem yavohu v'au. Okay, I'm not going to go the whole thing, but we see so clearly, I'm not going to the whole chapter read, but we see that they were causing a lot of problems for Israel, literally torturing them with food and all kinds of things. And then we see something very interesting. It says Israel became very poor because of the Midianites. And okay. Vayavo malach Hashem. And then it says an angel, I'm skipping over verses, getting to the end over here. Vayavo malach Hashem vayeshev tachat ha'ila asher be'ofra asher liyoash avi ha'izri. So here it says an angel of God came and it sat under the pistachio tree in Ofra, a place called Ofra, not the Ofra further away from me, a different place in our area, I said. V'gidon beno chovet chitim bagat, and Gideon is preparing the wheat in a gat. A gat is a place that they make wine, a wine press. Obviously, because he was trying to hide from the Midianites that wouldn't come and look at a wine press for wheat in order to save the wheat he had. And this angel appears to him, and he says, "You are a mighty warrior." God, the angel says, "You're a mighty warrior." And then he says like this, Gideon. So Gideon says like this, Bi Adoni v'yesh Hashem imanav. God is amongst us. Why did this all happen to us? Where are the amazing miracles that happened in Egypt and all these kind of things? Why did God abandon us and place us in the hand of the Midianites? And immediately it says that God turns to him, he says to him, Lech b'chochacha zeh, I want you to go with this power. V'oshatet Yisrael, I want you to save Israel. In other words, what power is he referring to? Right away Rashi brings down, what does it mean? B'koch haschut, with this schut. Shelamadeta sanegoria al banai, that you learn merit on my nation. The fact that you're showing your love for your brothers and sisters, for the nation of Israel. I want you to go with that power and save Israel. That will bring the save Israel. And in verse number 16 it says, Vayom elav Hashem ki I will be with you. V'kitat Midyan, you will strike the Midianites ki ish echad, as one man. What does it mean one man? Very quickly. But the ish echad, of course, is a hint, something very deep. As we all know in Genesis, number 42, Moshe, regarding Joseph, when the brothers came and Joseph was hiding who he was, what did they say? Anachnu b'nei ish echad. We are the children of one man, of Jacob, of course, and that same exact expression is used, one man, there, showing that the rectification of brotherly love was done through Gideon, who showed a love for his brothers and went to battle and was successful when they're united, which is fascinating. So in summary, and there's more we could talk about, I want to just summarize things. We saw a fascinating, I would say, examples of how the Midyan awakens. When they awaken, when they're given powers, we don't show our brotherly love, and that's really what happened in the Second Temple again, as we saw with the Admor Zaken, the way he explains it. And the evil forces of Midyan are the two forces. They try to lure us into the trap of uncleanliness, of behavior that is not suitable for Israel. And at the other hand, they try to lure us into the hatred of one another, to bring that, which go together, when there's a lack of respect for one another, there's a lack of control, people, are not always worried about their own personal selves, and it leads to hatred with one another. It's all connected. And that husk is what Moshe Rabbeinu had to deal with right before he passes away. And it wasn't enough, because it comes back later on, as we see the challenge here in Gideon has to challenge with that when Israel's in the land and when Israel's not showing love for one another. Obviously, they're all, they weren't respecting the judges. They weren't judging, letting the judges judge. They were judging the judges. There was a lack of unity amongst Israel. They were all living, as we see, the fighting amongst the tribes. And that was rectified by Gideon, who shows his love for his brothers. And then we see later on, at the end of that whole thing, is that they were totally, Vayikana Midyan lefnei bnei Yisrael. They totally were defeated before Israel. They gave up, literally, as we say in Hebrew, nichneu. And it says they did not lift their heads up. That's the way we have to treat our enemy. That's how we have to destroy these husks. And the land rested for 40 years. So again, here we are in the land of Israel now, modern times, right now. We don't know what's going to be in the next few hours, the next minute. The enemies are coming against us from all sides. And we're in battle against the same things. What's going on, unfortunately, a world that is very, very, has fallen so low in morality, in the way it relates to the things we spoke about over here, to sexual offenses, to terrible things that go on in the world in that respect. At the same time, the lack of unity and brotherly love. They come together and they bring us all these enemies that are coming around in Israel. We have to rectify our holiness within. At the same time, we're rectifying now the enemies that are coming against us, that stand for these, that come about. What gives them energy is when we don't behave properly. All the enemies of Israel would dissipate if we were on the right path, if we would behave properly. Our disunity is what brought us October 7th. And our unity will bring us victory over what's happening now. and we are unified much more. The nation of Israel is unified. There are always the select few, the datam bavirams, those who come about, the evil, we call them the Erev Rav forces, that are trying to allow and give and unify with those evil husks of the Midianites and the other husks. But we will overcome, because we see Israel, the nation, the majority, is a nation that loves one another, that wants to build a land of Israel, a kingdom of Hashem here in the land, of a nation that will be an example of a light to the nations, of doing good and justice, bring justice, true justice to the world. And literally, this is a time where the world is falling apart, and it seems in every direction. They need a light to the nations to show what holiness is, how a nation can live at peace with true values that are everlasting, values of Torah, not values that unfortunately bring about the terrible happenings that happen in the world. And that has to change. And that's all about what Midyan is all about, rectifying Midyan. Shabbat Shalom, B'sorot Tovot, Yeshuot V'nechamot.